Thank you, everybody, for joining. First, thank you, first and foremost, to all the panelists and the moderator for coming together and contributing your time and expertise in this specific field that we wanted to focus on today, which is artificial intelligence. So this is the first part of two-part series that we've created for the MIT Enterprise Forum, which we create educational events in the intersection between technology and entrepreneurship and business technologies. And how do we leverage technologies in the business world? So we came together and put together a range of professionals from very diverse backgrounds, from hardware to software. And we bring them together to kind of share their knowledge with the communities at large and to kind of talk about the technology and how it's being applied in today's world. So as I said before, this is the first series of two events on AI. And this is the first much more general aspect of AI and how it's being used across the board. So I'd love to first introduce Paul. He is at Emory for the Center of Ethics, and he's going to be moderating the event tonight. So I'll pass it on to Paul. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks so much, Robert. Welcome, everybody. Glad you're with us. We're going to be having a wide-ranging conversation of all the with our panelists. I hope you pepper us with questions in the Q&A, and I apologize in advance for those questions that we can't get to. I'm going to ask the panelists to introduce themselves briefly, and at the end I'll say a word about myself, and then we'll move into the substance of today's conversation. So Michael, will you start?
Sure, thanks so much for having me. My name's Michael Menino. I did my PhD in computational neuroscience, and then I took a role as director of programs at the Institute for Data Science and Computing at University of Miami, working on a wide variety of problems: smart cities, climate modeling, data ethics in society. Yeah, it's not really relevant, but I'm also a peak performance coach at the Flow Research Collective. So I'm very interested in peak performance and flow science and just the general intersection of AI and neuroscience.
Great.
Thanks for having me.
Great, thanks. Henry?
Sure, thanks for having me as well. My name is Henry. I am the founder and CEO of a company called Simple Fractal. We're a software firm based in New York. Our mission is to elevate human work by building software robots to automate repetitive tasks. A little bit about my background. I mentioned to the other panelists, and I have to mention to everybody, I'm born and raised in Sweden. I also spent some time in Hong Kong before coming to the States for college. I studied applied math, economics, and computer science, and then joined as an early engineer at a software startup in New York City, and founded Simple Fractal about 8 years ago now. And we started off doing custom software, and we've since honed in on RPA, or robotic process automation.
Great, thanks. Kevin?
Hi guys, glad to be here. My name is Kevin Tubbs. I'm the Senior Vice President of Strategic Solutions at a company called Penguin Computing. We specialize in designing, architecting, and deploying large-scale AI and high-performance computing systems. Background, bachelor's and master's in physics, PhD in engineering science, focused there on computational fluid dynamics, high-performance computing, and that's where I originally started with GPU programming, or general purpose GPU programming, which led me into kind of this AI. Basically, my expertise is in hardware and software, the intersection of hardware and software, and scaling workloads throughout cloud, edge, particularly with AI systems.
Great, thank you, Kevin. Daniel?
Hi, I'm Daniel Dowling. I'm the Senior Business Development Manager at NVIDIA. Long time in the hardware business. I've been in HPC for about 25 years with a number of different roles, from solutions architect to sales to business development to leading solutions architects to leading services. So I've kind of done it all on the hardware side. Recently joined NVIDIA, and really excited to take all that hardware knowledge and apply it to AI problems. My PhD is from in physics from the University of Maryland, and thrilled to be here. This will be a fun discussion.
Paul, let me add something real quick.
Sure, go ahead, Michael.
I forgot because everybody's mentioning their other degrees too. So my master's is in philosophy, and I was a philosophy professor teaching critical thinking and ethics. So I'm very interested in specializing in the philosophy of mind and philosophy of consciousness. That's why I went into neuroscience. So just wanted to add that component because I think we'll be talking about some of those things tonight.
Great. So as Robert mentioned, I direct the Center for Ethics at Emory University. I'm a social scientist, which is a rare thing for someone in ethics to be. Started out working in genetics and the ethics of the Human Genome Project, and then moved on to neuroscience. I'm the editor-in-chief of the American Journal of Bioethics Neuroscience, which is the main journal that deals with the social and ethical implications of neuroscience. And over the last 5 or 6 years have blended my work with neuroscience into AI, and have moved slowly more and more into AI and the ethics of AI and data science. So I'd like to start with a question. We often start with the question, what is AI? I'm a little tired of that one. So let's complicate it a little bit. And so you can say something about AI and your view of it, but what kinds of questions can AI help us solve, and what kinds of questions can AI not help us solve? Do we in general, or does the public in general have a misconception about what AI is for? So perhaps each of you can weigh in on that. Does someone want to start?
I'll go ahead and jump.
Go ahead, Daniel.
Go ahead, Daniel.
Okay, sorry, delay. Sorry.
Yeah.
I mean, but I sort of prepared for the canned question because I think I have a little bit of a different answer here. So what is AI? One way to look at it is and this is one of the things our CEO Jensen Huang talks about a lot, is it's software writing software. If you think about it, we start with these frameworks and these models and we train them, but the computer is actually writing the actual software that gets deployed to solve the problem. So in that sense, the artificial intelligence part is that we're essentially replacing the programmer, and in a lot of cases we're creating solutions that people can't write. Like if you wanted to sit down and write an algorithm for a self-driving car, that's much harder than training an AI to do it. So that's just, so I think that was just sort of an interesting, different approach to the answer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Michael?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is some misconception between the public and between the experts, largely due to a lot of media and movies and things like that. Obviously, there's a general distinction that we make even within AI ethics between narrow AI and general AI. Narrow AI being doing specific tasks, right, that humans do specifically, right, like driving a car, like detecting cancer, like those kinds of things. And then there's general AI, which is more along the lines of general human intelligence and mimicking all of the complexity and nuances of human intelligence. Maybe like it's termed artificial general intelligence. And then maybe you could even extend that to artificial super intelligence, right? Like demonstrating intelligence beyond the limitations of the biological neural networks, essentially. So I think there is that distinction. And even when we talk about questions of will AI replace jobs or tasks, or what will that look like? A lot of those distinctions just go away when people are thinking about them, right? The distinction between narrow AI focusing on specific tasks and general AI. So I think that's important to highlight.
Yeah, for me, it really comes down to the different types of problems to solve. So, in traditional programming, you think about something that's more explicit, something that's an algorithm, something that can be described in rules. That's one set of problems, right? You can do a lot with that. But then there's a whole other set of problems that cannot be easily described in a set of steps. Like recognizing each of our faces, for example, or distinguishing a cat from a dog, or a wolf from a husky. It's very difficult to articulate exactly how we do that. And so that is the set of problems that AI has the prompt to solve. And certainly it's already solving it in the narrow sense, right? But essentially learning from example as opposed to a more declarative approach of how to do it.
Great.
Right.
Thanks.
And I think that makes a lot of sense. And the distinction, and I like the distinction of narrow AI, and that's more where I practically sit and where I see most of our business and technology end users sit. I'm very interested on the other side, but I think it speaks to what everyone has said here, including Dan. It's software writing software. However, it's at the end of the day for narrow AI, it's a tool set. And being able to understand that current tool set from a computational science perspective and where it is now and how it influences the other technologies and enable us to do some things is really I think an eye-opening stepping stone. But at the end of the day, that software is writing software, but still relies, and narrow AI relies on a person. But it's just for me to be able to solve this problem, I can no longer think about all of the steps that are finite and program and predict or use some type of statistics to close that loop. I'm basically expanding my ability to search a parameter space that human capability or thought can't really get to. But the shift for me is, or what's exciting is, it's just another tool set that expands our intellectual creativity. So now I have a different tool to extend my ability, or I think our ability to solve problems. And I think for narrow AI, that's a key distinction of that kind of brings it all together. It's a tool set that allows us to open a different door to try to solve a problem that we're not limited to. And I think it's definitely a stepping stone in capabilities.
Right. I'm sorry, were you gonna follow up with something?
Yeah, I just was gonna follow up really, thank you. And what AI can do and what AI cannot do, right, is a very interesting question. I think relating this to in principle versus in practice is also like, what can human intelligence do in principle versus in practice? And I think that it's probably difficult to imagine what AI can or cannot do in principle when you make that distinction between artificial superintelligence, artificial general intelligence, and that's just a distinction that I'm making, right? We can make other distinctions as well. So, what are the necessary and sufficient criteria by which AI can do X, Y, and Z or cannot do? I think in principle versus in practice is another important distinction to make here.
Before we dig down and get in a certain depth, let me ask another broad question. Given those kinds of definitions, projecting into the future, of those capabilities, what really excites you? Where do you see some areas that you think AI will just be a real change in the human condition? And where does it worry you? Where are the areas where you're most concerned about the future of AI?
I'm excited about, can I take the role here?
Sure, go ahead, Michael.
I'm excited, very excited about just, being a neuroscientist, brain-computer interface. I'm very excited about well-being, the intersection of well-being and wellness and healthcare and AI. I think there's going to be a game changer in terms of being able to track our well-being and optimize human well-being. Where it's worrying me is, well, I'll start there and then I'll let other people say where it's worrying. So I'll stop there.
So what I'm really excited about is where AI essentially can augment human thought capabilities by playing to each other's strengths, right? So, we do a lot of RPA work, and unfortunately what I see a lot of industries still in a lot of places, we're using humans as robots. Things like data entry or very repetitive menial tasks that are error prone. And so part of our mission really is, hey, instead of using humans as robots, why don't we use machines as robots so that humans can do more? And from experience, I've seen most humans want to give more, have more to give, either with their minds or with their hearts, right, as opposed to just their hands.
So I'll go next. I think what excites me the most is come from the science engineering background, but the concept and ideas of grand challenges. So, and in physics and different places where we're usually pushing and trying to solve grand challenge problems, because it kind of pushes the edge of our understanding. And the application of AI in those areas, for me, are kind of what excites me. So even if you look at, and most of it for me is centered around computational science. So looking at different tools in healthcare and in science that help accelerate the discovery and learning of data-driven techniques, or techniques that, I've done a lot of work with searching parameter spaces and trying to statistically solve something that, you get orders of magnitude of capability and creativity to solve a problem by using AI to do that versus, kind of the, statistical methods or methods we're kind of used of. And I think that for me is kind of the most exciting, but it's really the extension of kind of human capability, human thought. But for me, it's core to the concept of a tool. Design a tool to extend the capability of humans. And I think that kind of symbiosis of using artificial intelligence to extend the capabilities of what humans can do is what the exciting part is.
Before I let Daniel chime in, after Daniel's done, I'm going to go back around and ask you what you think is challenging about it. But I'm going to challenge you to answer that question by saying, there's this whole, I give a talk on this. I can show you my slide with the 6 things that, AI, the 6 areas of challenge of AI. And there's bias, and there's privacy, and there's safety, and there's cyber hacking, and there's job displacement. They're all the classical things. So I'm going to challenge you. Can you give us a little different take on it, something a little non-obvious, a different way to think about some of the challenges? So let me just put that out there, and you'll have a minute to think about it while Daniel answers what excites him, and then we'll move back to the challenge of what's challenging. Go ahead, Daniel.
So I purposefully went last because I picked a topic that is both, and that is autonomy. So, I live here in the Bay Area, and we have horrible traffic. Even after COVID, the traffic is still awful. And every day I would drive to work, and I'd see all these cars that are individual drivers going to an individual place. And forget ride sharing, because you don't even, just to hook up. But if you can imagine, a world where you just subscribed to an autonomous vehicle service and it optimized everything and got you everywhere you needed, that would be fantastic, right? We wouldn't need to build new roads. We would, we could, make use of the time in the car. So things like that, or space exploration, things that JPL is doing with building autonomous rovers and things. So that's all really exciting. The scary part of that, of course, is the dark side, right? So whether it's been militarized or taken over by a bad actor, or because and I think we'll get to this in the ethics piece, is sort of like the goodness that you put in, or the goodness with which you train, is the kind of the value that you get out. And so what scares me is just the potential for using the technology to do things, at a massive scale, very bad things. So that's, I'll leave it there.
Someone else want to now pick up what else is challenging about this technology?
Can go.
Go ahead, Henry.
We talked a bit about, at least, narrow AI being an extension of humans. And so an inherent problem in that is the link, right? So how do we really manage narrow AI? How do we communicate with narrow AI? I could definitely see problems. I have seen problems where people make the wrong assumptions or misinterprets the results of AI or different models. That could be detrimental, right? So if you're working with a tool that you don't really understand, or you can't manage very well to your needs, then that, of course, severely limits the success of that.
I'll jump in. Yeah, Daniel, I agree with, I prepared some of my notes too for the AI, the ethics piece, like on the weaponization of AI and autonomous weapon systems. I think that's going to be a huge challenge, especially, I think in terms of bringing humanity together. I think that presents, how can we best utilize AI to connect us in the right ways and to promote collaboration and cooperation and connection. I think one of the biggest challenges in terms of personal identity, maybe that could be something unique. Susan Schneider has written a great book recently called Artificial You, and she is now the director of the Center for the Future Mind at Florida Atlantic University, where I did my PhD work. And the future of the mind, I think, is what is the future of the mind? What is the future of if narrow AI blends into general AI, what's the future of the mind philosophically? How are we going to deal with our own humanity? And what will that look like? I think these are more abstract, conceptual, philosophical issues rather than just specific ethical issues, right? There's more general issues about what is the nature of the mind and the future of the mind when we either merge with AI or get replaced with AI or all these kinds of things. But just in terms of discovering our own humanity, right? Like what's the future of personal identity and what does that look like and how do we accept that? These are like technological singularity kinds of questions. Maybe I don't want to like get into that,
but I think what's important about what you're saying, Michael, is that it's not going to happen it isn't going to be one day that happens, right? I mean, it's going to be a gradual process, and it's going to start with displacement of certain kinds of human agency. It's going to start with a certain amount of human retrocession as we begin to pull back from things that we used to do because now AI is doing it, and perhaps there'll be some skill loss there of human beings. Like, everybody used to know how to shoe a horse, and now nobody, very few people do. And there are a lot of tasks. If Henry gets his way and we have robots doing a lot of our repetitive tasks, will we lose the skill set as human beings do that? So it's going to be a step-by-step process. And what's difficult about gradual processes, and here I'm speaking as a sociologist, is that you never know when the moment is to try to stop it before it gets to a point where it has become a serious problem, because it's gradual, there's no lead. What's that?
The Milgram experiment.
The Milgram experiment. Yes, exactly.
Right.
It's progressive that way. So that's part of what the challenge of what you're saying, Michael.
Just to piggyback on that, I agree with you. I think right, nobody knows how to shoe a horse, but there's others. Nobody needs to shoe a horse, right? And moreover, when we talk about displacement of tasks and displacement of jobs, we of course know that, and there's predictions that 88 million jobs will be replaced, but then 97 million jobs will be gained, new kinds of tasks. So that continuity of human personal identity will change. I also think that it is a gradual step-by-step process, but there are nonlinear, exponential traction as well. And I do think there is a certain truth to these law of accelerating returns, and the rate at which technology is increasing now is increasing. Right, the next 10 years of technological progress, we'll see the last 100 years or whatever, is Moore's law coming to an end? We can ask those questions, but because of that exponential nature, that also presents a challenge to how we can actually keep up with that pace, right? In terms of our own human identity and person, consciousness.
So Kevin, thanks. Kevin, in your world, what worries you?
I think what worries me is I'll bring it back the other way, but it's very similar to what you guys are saying. But the pace of development and the pace of new skill sets, and I think we, from both a consumer and developer of AI, push the envelope, and I think for the most part we do it altruistically. But to what we talked about, there has to be a balance between the ethics and the social sides, because what we do in the bubble is push technology and really want to develop these things, but you don't really sit down and think about, to Dan's point, like what is this going to do in the hands of a bad actor or in somebody with malice? So it's almost as you want this push for technology and capabilities and opening new doors, we have to have something that's also pushing us from an ethical or social side, because we could diverge a lot in having a lot of power, or I think also to what you said about the skill sets, it's if we're allowing a lot of AI and autonomy and things like that, we lose skill sets, but we also can lose focus on what are we really trying to do and what are we here for? Like those type of things. And there's a void of it. It's, you kind of get in a vacuum, and there's a lot of things there that could go either way or be different parts of the tipping point. An example, like, you create social media to connect people, but are we really looking at it from personal connection? Like, are we losing skill sets, type of things like that? If I apply that to AI, I think that moves faster and has the potential to be dangerous faster because of the type of technology and a type of tool that can be built. And those abilities, you think about a good example would be deep fake videos, or do things that you can do to trick or perceive a human mind that if a person doesn't know about it, or doesn't have, or the overall population doesn't know about it enough, you now, because you have a certain technological power, can influence just human existence, because you can manipulate reality, you can manipulate certain things. So how do we balance, what concerns me is how do we balance our ethical and social side with this massive push in technology, which we all want, and I think ultimately contributes to the betterment of humanity, but you can't go one way or out the other. So that's kind of what concerns me.
Right. And so there's this tension between us keeping control of this technology and us releasing control to the technology, both of which we want to do. I mean, the thing that makes AI exciting is that we don't have to, it releases us from certain kinds of tasks. It releases us from attention to things that we're not that interested in. But in that release also comes a danger of lack of oversight. And we saw that in a lot of the early stuff around bias, where people used, algorithms without recognizing. Now everybody at least is aware that that is a problem. But of course, at the beginning, you saw all of these examples of biases that were built into the programs that people didn't recognize. And the question is, what else will we not recognize until perhaps it's already caused harm?
Yeah.
So let's talk just one more minute about what AI can do and can't do before we move into some of these questions. And we had a couple questions in the Q&A that I want to work into the next question, which is, so you've got AI that can do the repetitive tasks that Henry is trying to help us release from. Then you've got perhaps, and I'm making this up as I go along, so I haven't thought this through. It may not be that accurate, but you'll get what I'm trying to get to. Then you've got a second kind of AI, perhaps, that makes decisions. Some of these programs that have been, that help decide who gets a mortgage. I just gave a talk to a group of AI executives, and they're using, HR executives, and they're using AI to try to help them look through resumes. That kind of AI that helps make decisions. And then there's a third, someday in the future AI that's either AGI, general intelligence, or as someone asked, Gordon asks in the Q&A, that perhaps could even be creative, could create original kinds of things. So what is possible along that spectrum? Are we really going to have AI at some point that mirrors the science fiction AI, and we've got a really fully sentient, aware program that can paint an original painting or write an original piece of work? We're beginning to see music. We're beginning to see that emerge now. Is that in our future, and should that worry us?
We're still trying to figure out how the brain is creative. But that doesn't take away from the question, right? That doesn't negate the question. I think there is aspects that I think the answer to that question is yes. Should it worry us? I think the jury's still out on that yet. But I do think that AI can be creative if we operationalize creativity, maybe the way the brain does, like with divergent thinking, and other ways to look at creativity. I mean, creativity and logic and reason coexist. Creativity, we've just discovered, for example, this is out of John Cunios's lab at Drexel in Philadelphia, that creativity, novice creativity is different actually than expert creativity in jazz improvisation. So we really have to like really get clear on what we mean by creativity to sort of answer that question. And new things are being discovered now, so it's very hard to like predict what will be of that. I think it was last year that a study came out that there was like you correct me if I'm wrong, maybe Paul, you know about this, but in biological neural networks, the cell bodies and the dendrites also have computational properties over and above the actual neuron and the communication with other neurons as well. So this might suggest that, you know, in deep neural networks, the actual nodes will eventually have computational properties that they don't now, right? So what will that be like when we sort of nail that down? I think it's very difficult to predict. And that's a hand wavy answer to say, I don't know.
So I definitely think that AI can be creative. And I think there's been a certain manifestation. I'm thinking about AlphaGo here. I don't know if those of you who saw that document. To me, it was very, very impressive to see AI beat the best Go player so soon after beating the best, being the best chess player. And there was a particular part where AlphaGo played a move that no human expert would even have considered, because it's just so unthinkable, but turned out in the end to be a really brilliant move. And so, if that's not creativity, then, what is? Like, in a way, human thought was limited by history there, whereas AlphaGo was going more from first principles and finding a new way to think about the position and finding a new move that basically no human expert really found. So, of course, that's in a very simplified model. I mean, Go is complex, but still a very simplified model of the world, right? But so therefore, I think AI can be creative in its narrow realm already today and has the potential to be in broader realms in the future.
Yeah, I would, jump onto that in that, today it exists, there are AI music composing routines. In fact, like I said, my company used one for the opening of our GPU technology conference. And I just recently watched a video on how it was created, and they basically, taught it music, so this notion of being creative from, that sort of builds on other knowledge certainly is a place where AI can play today. Another thing, like with painting, we have a bunch of different programs. You can say, okay, paint a tree and a sunset and a mountain, and it will paint a beautiful landscape. What would be really interesting to think about is, when does AI start inventing the game? I mean, it's one thing to play Go really well, like Henry said, with a set of rules, but what if AI could invent a game, and then teach us to play it? I mean, that I think where we call creative, I think is probably what we're trying to tease out here. Yeah.
Yeah. So Henry, you play Go and you play chess, and how good are games as a model for understanding how far AI can go?
So, I mean, I think games are like an excellent kind of training ground, right, for AI as we develop it, because the rules are very clear and there's relatively few rules. Mm-hmm. And for example, in games like chess and Go, they're perfect information games. So it reduces the search space so much that we can, apply our techniques and really get pretty good results. I mean, I think one challenge, I think there's going to be progressive. I mean, it was first chess, then it was Go, then it was StarCraft, those of you familiar, which is like a not perfect information game. It's real time, not turn-based. You have poker, right? Also not perfect information, where AI can beat the best player heads up, but not in a multi-handed game, because that's more complex. Yet, so what I think will happen is that it will progress, but the problem ultimately is no model will be good enough to represent the world, right? No AI. So in a sense, no AI can exist in the real world. It always has to exist in some model which is always going to be some simplification of the world. And so, I wonder if that presents some sort of limit, towards where AI could eventually go. It may not matter from a practical perspective, but at least theoretically, it seems you can only optimize anything within a certain model. That model is not going to be reality, whereas we humans live in reality. So it's a different playing field.
Can I piggyback on that?
Yeah.
Henry, I agree with you. Jeopardy too, right? I don't know if you mentioned
Yeah.
Jeopardy.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I just want to reflect on that for a second. I agree with you that models are simplified representations of reality. But if they can be used to describe reality, explain reality, and make predictions from reality, I think that's what makes a model balanced. The brain does that too, though, right? So when you say humans, we live in reality, the brain's number one job is to filter out information, and it's a prediction generating, engine. If you subscribe to certain theories in neuroscience like predictive coding and whatnot, or Bayesian inference, or things like that, how the brain works. But the brain also essentially, I would say, as a neuroscientist, creates a model of reality. And that model can be easily mistaken as it is, and it can be easily fooled, even with its own body. And so I think that if that's the case, if the brain does that too, then maybe that's an argument for AI, possibly being creative in the way that the brain is creative, an embodied brain is creative, maybe.
That is fascinating. I hadn't thought about it that way, but I agree with you. I mean, even our human cognition is limited to our senses, right? And we already know our senses only perceive a small portion of reality. Mm-hmm. So, who am I to say that, we live in reality, right? We still live in some simplification of reality.
Right. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and I think another one that's very similar to this, even if we take it to science or physics, and a background in computational fluid dynamics, and following through that, it's all partial differential equations, analytical. We start moving to computational, and so anytime I want to simulate a fluid, and I think it all started more so in gaming, which Dan can speak to. With his company, but I want to create a realistic example of, or visual representation inside a computer of water moving around. It's very complex, and the humans tried to create tools and techniques to approximate that until there was computational power to actually solve those partial differential equations in near real time or close enough, so you get really more realistic. But the cool thing there was, and it kind of speaks to what you guys saying, observation, physics and equations we derive from observation and theory on one approach, so I can deterministically simulate something. And then I train an AI model coupled with that simulation. And then that AI model creates a model that can approximate solving a partial differential equation solver. And at that point, which one's solving it deterministically, one's interpreting data and creating a model, and they're able to produce the same or similar results, definitely at a perceptual level. So to a human, you don't know if it was solved with, especially if you're looking at a simulation of it, you don't know if it was solved with a partial differential equation or if it was solved with a model. But then if you actually look into the data, and it's getting very close there, that I can get orders of precision inside of a computer or inside of simulation, that there's no real major difference between the two. So it almost comes back to, can I reach a certain path by using human thought and creating and absorbing the world and describing it, which is a model in itself. And then I let a computer do that from a AI model, and we end up in the same place. And that's kind of the duality of it that's mind-boggling for me, but it speaks to some of the same concepts you guys are talking about. Like what is the definition of creativity, and what's the difference whether the way the human did it or where we started to do it in AI, and where that merges or intersects is going to be interesting as we move forward.
It's complicated to know when we are when we're defending only humans should do this or human agency is being eroded, it's hard to know where that is an appropriate and a real argument, and it really diminishes, human agency and flourishing, and where that's an artifact of a new technology that we're not used to yet. And just like shoeing the horse is something that we don't really need anymore. And I think negotiating that balance as we move forward is going to be one of the real tasks of assimilating AI into society.
Yeah.
So go ahead, Michael.
No, I was just going to say, back to like what we were talking about a little earlier. I mean, the distinction between narrow AI and general AI, maybe like super AI, when it comes to that, the creativity. I mean, what about the scientific process itself, right? I was thinking about this when Kevin was talking. The scientific processes itself has a component of creativity. So when Daniel was saying about, can AI create a game and create rules of a game and make it fun and interesting and then teach us that game, will AI be able to do science? I mean, simple, narrow AI can do amazing things now. AI can recognize depression in a child's speech, right? Mm-hmm. Amazing. Right, that's narrow AI. The human brain cannot do that, right? So the human brain cannot recognize patterns in that way because of its information processing, embodied information processing capabilities. But like I'm thinking back to Richard Feynman, right? How do you conduct the scientific process? Well, you first make a guess, right? And you make a guess, and then you come up with a theory, and if the theory disagrees with experiment, no matter how smart you are, how rich you are, how much money you have, you're wrong, right? But making that guess is a creative act, right? And Einstein imagined riding a beam of light. Newton imagined, thinking about in terms of creativity and imagination, imagine the connection between a falling apple and the moon. I mean, that sorts of creativity in the scientific process is something altogether different than the creativity of making an innovative move in Go or painting. And that, I think, is something that we'll have to just see. We'll have to wait and see.
So let's move from the, we've spoken very broadly, talked about AI theoretically. Let's move down to the practical world and ask some questions about AI itself. So first of all, we've identified some issues and problems, and yet right now AI has no regulation, no oversight. There's nobody in charge of it. There's not even a federal agency in charge of it. It's the Wild West out there, and that, of course, allows enormous innovation. It lets people try things and do things, but it also both creates problems of unfettered AI use in places where it may not be appropriate, where it may be deeply biased. And also, I think, again, sorry, with my sociology hat on, I think it is a PR problem for AI, because it scares the public to think that there's sort of a rampant, uncontrolled AI out there. And historically, the public has been very skeptical of unregulated science. They still sort of have the mad scientist image sometimes in their mind of, scientists in a back room creating things that, they shouldn't be playing with. So how do we bring the EU has been much better than the States at trying to create some policies and regulations about it. How do we balance the need for innovation with the need for regulation and control of this technology?
Well, I think we better start the conversation. I mean, I think it's gonna be important, but almost certainly will we get it wrong. So we may as well start iterating, to have the conversation and talk about, okay, what are some ways that we can, still not restrict the positive benefits of AI, but perhaps mitigate the risks of the downsides. It's just so hard. I mean, it's hard to regulate in other industries already, and I can only imagine, like, for AI, where we barely understand it, how hard it's going to be to regulate. I think we're just going to have to expect to get it wrong, but we have to start thinking about it. That's what I think.
Yeah, I would echo that. As the question was posed, is like, well, how would you do that? You know, the just the thought. I mean, you know, with my company GPUs, right? You know, you can build things, you know, very inexpensively, you know, and create, you know, create algorithms, or you know, create inferencing machines that will do things, and you don't need to ask anybody permission. I mean, and it's very unlikely that anybody would know what you were doing. Or like, you know, pick any of the big companies, you know, like what's Facebook doing right now with AI, right? We know they're doing something, but they don't have to tell us. And so how would we but to Henry's point, you know, God, we got to start talking about it because yeah, when we worry about the bad actors, or, you know, you know, yeah, it's interesting question.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think at some point, what we have now, I think practically, you're regulating the narrow AI. And a good example there, that's still not solved, but what do? You know, Dan brought up autonomous driving. That's one of the use cases that is very close to being ubiquitous. But one of the conversations I've enjoyed, and you know, from the ethics and the legal side, is it's sparked up a lot of conversation of an entire industry, insurance industry. Where does the blame go? Does it go to the car, the software? So, you know, if I buy autonomous driving, I never take control of it. Why am I, you know, do I personally have to insure it? You know, so those conversations, and I think we have to start regulating, definitely regulating the narrow AI part and how it's applied. And I think you do have some examples of that, but I do agree with Henry. It's like we have to iterate like that. You have to have the assumption that's going to be wrong. Like, you know, no one has that answer right now, but not having the answer can't stop us from the conversation.
But you're exactly right, Kevin. I mean, liability and accountability are going to be big issues around this. And there's no better example than autonomous vehicles, because you've got so many people contributing to a vehicle. And then you've got, you know, different kinds of ownership of vehicles. If we have the world that Daniel's talking about, where nobody really owns cars anymore, but you just call one up and it comes and takes you where you want to go, then where does liability lie? Yeah, so liability is going to be a very big issue, and not just with autonomous vehicles, but in AI. Once it gets deeply integrated into systems, you know, it's going to be even harder to know who to point the finger at when things go wrong.
I think we have to have this public conversation now. I think AI is a qualitatively distinct kind of technology. In no time in history, we've had technologies where you can computer, the internet, you know, cars, these light bulb, these kinds of things. You know, you think about like light bulb and privacy, right? I think there's the story in Paris or London back in the 1600s with light bulbs were I lost you guys.
We have some, I think Michael froze. Just,
yeah.
There it is. I'm back. Okay.
You're back. Okay. Yes, you're back.
Okay.
Michael.
So, there we go. My connection was unstable. Sorry about that. These technology, AI is a qualitatively distinct kind of technology where we need to be thinking about these questions now more than ever. Even with, I was going to give this example of light bulbs, right? Street lamps. People were, now we don't care about street lamps, right? Obviously, but in terms of privacy, right? But street lamps were you know, when they were first, you know, made a thing, right? In the streets of Paris or London, there was like, correct me if I'm wrong with this anecdotal story, but there was, you know, backlash against that. I mean, people doing nefarious kinds of things in the alleys. People don't want the lights shining in on the houses, and so on and so forth, right? So we did change the nature of thinking about that with an example like a light bulb, but scientists, these sorts of questions about morality and ethics and legality, these are not science questions, right? These are legal, these are philosophical questions. So I don't know who's going to be responsible for these things, but we need to start connecting and establishing firm relationships at the outset between philosophers and scientists. This is one of those, right? More so than just a car or a plane or a computer, right? if you're learning about computer science or AI engineering, you also need to have some grasp of critical thinking, of how to think about ethical issues and dilemmas. It's just that's more than ever now with this kind of technology, AI, as opposed qualitatively to other kinds of technologies.
Yeah, one thing on that I found that as I thought about as you're talking, that's very interesting because like for the technical side and science engineering, you see this trend, and especially I think now with AI, that it's interdisciplinary. We're getting to the point that you can't learn one thing and you're going to, AI is going to be center of, a lot of scientific and engineering development. But in the same breath as you're saying, it's interdisciplinary across the point that I can't just be a scientist engineer with AI. I have to be,
Right.
a philosopher. I have to be, I have to study ethics. Like you can't have one without the other. And then the question there is that where, like that is true interdisciplinary? Like we're going back to a person, a contributing member to society has to have, both sides. You have to have this driving you the ability to, because you can't sit down and just do the technical part. You actually have to interact and understand and engage at what the philosophical and ethical things that you're doing interact. And like, is that a good thing or a bad thing?
And here we're talking about the people who implement it. I remember, and I'm sure all of you, know this to some degree, but I'm older than most of you. I remember back in the early days of personal computers, where at times it was very, very difficult. You had to really study, the average consumer was constantly calling in the IT guy to know what to type in just to get simple things done. And there was a forum like this that I was a part of, where a computer scientist said, that's not the consumer's responsibility, that's the designer's responsibility. We're just not there yet. And there will come a time when computers will be simple enough that that even someone without any knowledge can just point and click at things. And he was right, of course, to some degree, that as these technologies move on, we discover how to make them more amenable to users. So now we have to ask the question, if we're talking about how intrinsic to AI is bias and is the problems of human agency and retrocession and privacy, what is the consumer's responsibility here? And do I as a consumer, will I need to learn something about AI? Will I need to understand the nature of all the problems that Kevin and Michael are talking about in order to just be a casual consumer? Are we going to be where personal computing was before Windows, where you had to understand backslashes and things like that in order to get anything done? Is that going to be a transitive period? Is that going to be the future of AI? Where do you see that going? What is the consumer's responsibility with AI? Or is it a design problem? Is it, if I as a consumer need to learn all about AI, then AI isn't mature yet?
No, I agree with the design problem, and I agree with the analogy you made. And if AI makes that same transition, you're actually stumping me, because now I do want some type of regulation, because if it's that easy to use AI as a tool, like how do you something that power and like where we use it at the design phase, when it comes down to any consumer can use it, it is an incredibly powerful tool.
Right.
That is a stepping stone on top of a computer as a computational device, as a a human experience tool. Yeah, that actually now have a new concern for.
Right. Well, I think of the analogy in another world I live in, which is in genetics and biology, because CRISPR makes manipulating cells so easy that a good graduate student can now do things that the greatest scientists in the world couldn't do 10 years ago, in terms of fundamentally altering cells and altering cellular genomes. And it's very worrisome, the do-it-yourself potential of that to create a toxin or to create a pathogen or something that could really harm us or the environment is very real. So, it's interesting to wonder if that's also going to be a concern about AI if we get to the point where AI becomes as user-friendly in that way as CRISPR is right now.
So yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I was thinking of it the other way actually, from the consumer standpoint. I was thinking about data, right? And I feel like the limiting factor a lot of the time tends to be, the quality and volume and richness of the data, which, oftentimes, companies will use consumer data, right, to train models, which then may or may not be to the benefit of the consumer. How do we, yeah, I mean, how do we deal with that? Because I feel like it's, ideally, everyone would educate themselves, at least to some degree, so that they, the average consumer knows what's going on. That'd be great, but I feel like it might be aspirational. I feel like even, trying to educate people on cookies and stuff has had some limited success, right? Like people still don't know really what they are and what they do. So yeah, I feel like that. But maybe it mitigates Kevin's concern a little bit, like in the sense that if there's like a, open source download, you can do anyone can do AI like from their laptops. Well, if you don't have the data, there's not that much you can do, right? So in a way, it's a check on it, but it still, brings up this other question of like, well, who, does the consumer do they own their own data, or not, right? Because data is going to be one of the most valuable assets in developing AI.
Right.
Good point.
So let's turn, there have been a lot of questions coming on the heels of your comment earlier, Michael, about job displacement. So let's talk for a minute about that, because in the Q&A, there are 2 or 3 questions about that. So what kinds of jobs are going to be displaced? Are we going to displace repetitive jobs and only have higher level jobs that maybe some people aren't going to be qualified for? Is it going to move the entire, job structure towards higher educated, more skilled labor? Is the assumption here that everybody will be more educated and more skilled? Or are we eliminating jobs that eliminate a whole class of people who depend on less skilled labor in order to survive? So the questions are, what will job displacement look like in the short term and the long term? What kinds of jobs will be destroyed and created? And is this the next industrial revolution that changed the entire nature of human labor?
Well, I think the numbers that I was referring to were from the World Economic Forum. Predictions about what jobs will be lost, what types of jobs will be gained, what new jobs will be created, ways to upskill and reskill people. Like Henry has pointed out, right, that the field he's working in, the computers are great at really repetitive tasks. So they can take that over. Even non-repetitive tasks. Well, I mean, like radiological reporting, radiological reading, AI can do that sort of much better now, detecting like skin cancer, recognizing depression in child speech, those kinds of things. But when it comes to, I don't think that AI can really replicate other areas of the brain that are really complex. Machines just can't do that right now. Creative tasks, highly strategic jobs, teaching, problem solving, musicians, artists, writers, inventors, market, all of these kinds of jobs. I don't think will, and we also want to make a distinction between repetitive tasks and repetitive jobs, or like jobs and tasks as well. I think that's an important distinction to make. I'm not sure, but I think that there is a worry, probably not so much in the short term, but probably in the long term with like AGI or super intelligence. But machines just cannot replicate complex decision-making properties of the brain right now that are required in a lot of types of jobs. So, right.
Other comments?
Yeah, so I mean, I've been thinking about this because I see it to some extent in my field of work. Couple of comments. I mean, I think number one, I don't think it necessarily has to mean that everyone needs higher skill jobs. Like, for example, human connection, caring for someone, like bringing back care to healthcare, right? Just the paper shuffling of healthcare costs $1 trillion a year in this country, which is mind-boggling. Just because there's so much administration that needs to happen, and in fact, it's burning out people, and I get it. It doesn't matter how smart or how diligent you are, you're going to make mistakes, and then you're also going to burn out. So one is, it doesn't necessarily have to be more skilled. Like I was saying earlier, like most people have more to give, either with their minds or with their hearts, right? Compared to with just their hands, mechanically doing data entry, for example. The other notion is like, long term, I am a cautious optimist long term, in that I think that the nature of work is going to change, like it has, with many industrial revolution, agricultural revolution, many revolutions in the past, where the productive activities that humans do just change in nature. And is that a good thing? I think generally, at least if we look back in history, generally speaking, it has been in the long term. In the short term, it's led to some periods of painful transitions. But if we're today were to say, hey, you know what? Let's just open up some, really dangerous, unhealthy factories and just create, a ton of jobs that way using manual labor, or let's just ditch all of our tractors and just, work the fields like we did millennia ago. That would create a lot of jobs, right? But it would seem absurd in terms of the quality of human life and progress. So I'm cautiously optimistic that we'll see something similar long term with this now kind of digital revolution, right, that we see, where I believe in the near term, at least, again, the more repetitive digital tasks can and should be delegated to machines, so that the humans performing those tasks, but really, I don't think was the intent to begin with anyway. Again, using humans as robots is not, I don't think it's a good thing, but they will need to find other things to do. And I think that they can, and that they will.
Okay, let's in a few minutes we're going to start taking questions from the audience. But let me go back to one thing we talked about, comment you made, Henry, about the importance of data and the value of data. Some of you may have read Shoshana Zuboff's book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, or read a synopsis of it. And in it, she basically argues that because data is so crucial, it has become valued such that companies are doing whatever they can to gather it. And the way they're gathering it is not tricking, might be too strong a word, but convincing people that getting Facebook for free is worth giving away all your data to Facebook. And the old saw that if the service is free, you're the product. So we are giving away reams of data. I think the average person is always shocked when they see some really good computer hacker tell them everything that they can find out about them just by, mining data. How is this going to, is the nature of privacy changing? Are we willing to give up our privacy for this? Are we going to be able to take data back? Is there going to be we might be seeing some of this already, but is there going to be a backlash against this? Are we going to move once, now we're talking about federated machine learning, where it can live on my phone rather than me having to use the cloud, and I can keep a lot of my data contained. So what is the future of data and data ethics in terms of our right to control our data versus the need, the rapacious need of AI to use data to learn and to grow?
So one thing there, I agree with the data side, and I think it's going to be increasingly important, but it's a tricky one because, the key is the data. I don't, for federated AI and learning, if I could, to your point, if I can keep my data, kind of confined, it's not necessarily going to help. But in terms of what I've seen some in the research is how can I add encryption and ownership of my data, but still participate in the mass amount of data or collective data. And so there is a lot of area of research there is, can I train and infer on encrypted data that's able to allow me to contribute to the mass amount of data that needs for AI development and train and infer, but me still own mine. But I think it's a reoccurring theme, and the answer is going to be in the technological capability to develop that technology into AI, but also the social and ethical and legal part of, we're gonna have to enable a way or some type of judgment on who owns your own data, and is my data actually, like, is that concept of privacy enforceable or real? Like, is privacy actually real? So yeah, that's two different sides, but I think that's another interesting area. So
Yeah, it's a tough one, because I feel like, the whole point about AI is that there's definitely going to be like economies of scale, to data. If you need that, you need to centralize data, and if you do that, there's always going to be a risk. Doesn't matter, if you encrypt it or you do other things, there's always going to be a risk that it gets out. And even if you do everything right, the public may not trust that you will, right? Like, we don't trust our Google Home or Alexa, whatever, right? That so a lot of people don't anyway.
All right.
So how do we deal with that? And the problem is, if you impose restrictions and policies, they may be so practically infeasible. Like, imagine if you had to give consent, with a pop-up every time anyone were to collect anything about you. It wouldn't be feasible to live life that way, and any consumer would give up after a little bit.
Oh, good point.
Right? So the issue of that. And then, of course, there's the issue of, like, just, other countries or regions, if they are less restrictive, they are going to be able to compete way faster.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I'm thinking about Asia, for example, or China in particular. If all data, say, I actually don't know if it's actually like this, but say if all data is owned by the state, there's just so much more data that you can gather so much faster, and therefore you can develop much better AI much faster than, say, Europe or the US, if we were to impose heavy restrictions on who gets access to the data, especially considering the practical hurdles that might come with that.
Yeah, agreed. Back to your point, Paul, I think it was Benjamin Franklin, right, who said, those who are willing to give up essential liberties for more security deserve neither and will lose both. I think the nature of that statement is actually changing because of big data and AI. I don't think it applies in the same situation. I think the nature of privacy is changing and will change, especially with general artificial intelligence. I love that quote from Doug Fisher, an AI expert. He said, thanks to big data, machines can now be programmed to do the next thing right, but only humans can do the next right thing. And so I think it's really important to establish these things now in terms of what privacy will look like. Data ownership, as we're talking about now, is a huge thing where we need to have, I don't know, like the Apples, the Amazons, the Googles, and the Facebooks of the world have access to all this data, which we don't. Whether that kind of like model, economic model, will survive into the future, given what AI can do, I don't know. But it's something that we need to really hammer out now. Yeah.
It's interesting because I was called in to consult with a company that had gotten very, very big, very well known, and but had started out as a service company, and then one day, as you know, there was sort of one day when data became valuable, and they realized they had this trove of data from their years of functioning that was now worth an extraordinary amount of money because they were the only company that had this data. But their founding and their function and their value system was not to sell their data. It was to provide this particular service. And there was a real paroxysm in the company, especially between the executives and the programmers who had come there in order to service, because they believed in the service, while the executives were saying, we've got all of this value now that we can sell. And the company had a great internal value conflict about whether to sell that data or not. So this issue of owning data, controlling data, the value of data, and monetizing data, I think is just going to become a bigger and bigger issue for companies across the board. You know,
yeah.
Who knows? I mean, if you own a string of cleaning, dry cleaning companies, all of a sudden 30 years of data of who cleans what, when, and how much might end up being more valuable than the money you get from cleaning clothes, right? I mean, that's what's happening right now with AI.
Yeah, and like another just confounding factor there as well is I feel like, just an industry, there may be, data sets, anonymized data sets, et cetera, then in and of themselves may look fine, they may look clean.
Right.
But then you combine them, with lots of other data sets, and then it gets more blurry, right? Because, if you get more angles, there may be ways you can triangulate or infer, and so, you're not going to know that if you just sell one data set, what is going to be used together with it.
Mm-hmm.
How do we possibly, how do we create restrictions and regulation around that is another dimension too.
All right, let's look at the Q&A list. I've been trying to I have incorporated some of the questions in, but in the last few minutes, let's let people ask the questions their way. I'm just going to read a few questions. Some of them might just be based on misunderstandings of AI or things. I'm just going to read them as they are. Since ultimately people create the algorithms and programming that creates the programming, how do you deal with the problems of human bias and the fact that it is not regulated? So does human bias get into the design of AI from the beginning?
I don't think it gets into the design of AI in the sense of models or more of the practical, but more the, I guess, you can then create a end product that can be used and can have the inherent bias. But that's the putting the things together to create something. So, if you're creating, computer vision algorithms, I don't think the core tools, the programmer can insert the bias. Well, actually, I think there's some other way. Thinking about not bad actor, they can't influence the bias, but it's more now that I have these building blocks and I want to create an app, can that person use that in a certain way? And I think that's more on that's not just a common consumer user, but that's somebody using that tool in a certain way. And I think that's where the bias would mostly come in, but that's kind of my opinion.
For me, I mean, in addition to that, in terms of how the tool, the AI is used, I think there's also very easily there could be inherent bias in the model, not as a result of the technique, but as a result of the data you're using.
Right.
Exactly.
So I think an example was, I think it was Amazon was trying to do this, use AI to basically screen through the resumes and, find good candidates. And of course they used history. They used their previous candidates as their data to train this, which was biased. And so now we have a biased model, right? And so this comes back to one of the things I mentioned earlier about what I'm nervous about, which is if you are not aware of that, right, you could easily use AI in a way that you think is good and is well-intentioned, but may actually cause issues or damage unintentionally.
Right.
jumping on that, I agree with you, and I also agree with Kevin's comments too. Garbage in, garbage out is also applicable to machine learning, right, and deep learning. And if your data is not complete, is there ever a complete data set, right? If your data set is not complete in that sense, it's biased, then your output is also going to be biased, and then you'll get into these problems that Henry's talking about. I also think modelers and the model itself the bias can be built into the models themselves as well, not only into the data going in, but the models themselves. We humans have cognitive biases, and those cognitive biases can also be built into the models, right? Unintentionally or intentionally, right? Like deep fakes, right? And there's an intentional for using AI in nefarious ways. There's also unintentional ways as well. And Paul, you mentioned these sort of all these examples, Facebook ads, AI is sending people to jail and getting it wrong, recidivism scores, Amazon, Henry, you mentioned that, banking, loans, all of these biases are there. Largely those were because of the data that the models are being trained on. But again, it can also, the biases can be built inherently into the models themselves because of human cognitive biases. I think as well.
Okay, let's move on to this question. This is a concern of the public. It's something we see in fictional portrayals of AI perhaps down the line. Could AI ever independently decide to change the ethical rules of its function, or for that matter, any rules of its function? For example, financial AI taking advantage of humans in stock equity transactions so that humans unfairly lose money in financial markets. And could AI increase the power of companies having the wealth to afford to purchase very advanced AI? So do we have a question of what we in the biz call distributional justice? That is, some people get it and some people don't.
So my first reaction is yes. So, for example, in the trading use case, yeah, like intentionally people will build, these algorithms to try to make money, right, off of the market. But as to the question of could the AI reprogram its own fundamental principles? Mm-hmm. That is a more interesting question. I mean, if you, I think in theory, if you do a good job setting the foundation, maybe it's possible that certain invariants could never be modified. I mean, that would be ideal, right? I mean, I think people are already starting thinking about this, that, AI should never harm human beings. AI should always be able to declare why it did something. Humans should always be able to override them, etc. But then there's a question of, well, what if you have AI that can physically create, another robot or with AI that then follows other rules? Could you program that into the beginning? Maybe. It's hard to say because certain models like deep learning, for example, the whole point is that you start with a clean slate and then you train it, and then you don't actually really know how the neural net is shaped and weighted. You just know the input output, right? And so it's a black box. Right. And that can be dangerous, for lots of different reasons. And so for deep learning, I'm thinking about, AlphaGo and all that again. Then it becomes so important, like what do you set as your objective function? What are you optimizing for, right? And if you're not careful about that design, there may be ways that it could be interpreted such that there's unintended consequences.
Yeah, no, I think, and also in this one, and I've had some experience from, dealing with different customers and clients. And for me, it was always one that I was shocked that the financial industry was not an early adopter, and that's relatively early. But what I got back from a lot of the institutions, and this is where I talked about earlier, there is regulation on some things that do slow down the use of AI. And particularly here, was earlier on, and early on, financial institutions were very limited in the use of AI because a lot of the regulation has auditability and traceability of what's being done. And to Henry's point, a lot of that, you lose that when you use a deep learning model. So early on, they didn't have that adoption, but with the overall goal of capitalism, and there is a lot of AI in financial trading now. So it's a very interesting thing for me that it did slow it down in the beginning, but there's ways kind of around it. And it speaks more to the second part of the question that I definitely do think that it presents an accelerated tool that can speak to the have and have nots, because it's who has the money to invest in AI and who has the capabilities do have a certain period of time that they have access to computational capability, AI capability that others don't, and that could create and continue to create that divide. But I think that's more speaks to human nature than the AI itself. The AI didn't do it. It was just a tool right now that enables that. And early on, that's always going to be the case. So, and I don't know, speaking back to whether or not it changes its course speaks to which type. A lot of what's being applied and done now is that narrow AI that Michael talked about. But in order to do the other things, those are in the general or super AI types and that's still an open question. I don't know if we can say that it'll never be able to change.
I think
its ethics.
Yeah, I piggybacking on that, Kevin. That was a good point. You just made me think about the last thing there. We can get really philosophical in terms of ethics, right? There are different ways. There are different rules by which to make moral decisions. Mm-hmm. Even that humans go by, right? Like we know. I don't know if you know the trolley problem. I won't go over it just in a little time, but there are different theories in ethics and morality about how to go about by which normative principles we should make moral decisions. Act-based utilitarianism, rule-based utilitarianism. Should we make decisions based on this or that principle? So we change the ethical rules, to go back to the original question of our moral decision-making functionality. So I do think that there seems to be a possibility of AI. AI needs to choose an ethical system by which to make its decisions, and that could possibly happen. That possibly.
So we're running out of time, but I want to ask this question. We just heard over the last day or two that Biden administration may pass its first bipartisan legislation that will increase multi-billion-dollar boost to U.S. technology and science. And yet there's a question about, someone wrote, for almost every point covered today, I suggest we consider, quote, and in China, close quote. Otherwise, the conversation is insular and perhaps irrelevant. So we've got this important question about how we regulate and how we make sure it's ethical, and how we, are trying at the same time that we're trying to compete with other countries, and especially, 2 or 3 of our major competitors that may not be under the same constraints. Mm-hmm. So how do we balance that? How do we think about the need to keep our AI ethical while at the same time remaining competitive with groups that may not have the commitment that we have? I just wanted the last question to stump everybody. That
is a really hard one.
That's a really difficult, perhaps the most difficult question. Yeah.
So let me say something about that just quickly that may also spark. So the same question was asked in genetic science. Okay. And what ended up happening there was there really became a global consensus about what the ethical standards were. And if you didn't adhere to them, you were kind of a pariah in the global conversation and communication around these technologies. And you know, China was also kind of a cowboy in that field too, and eventually brought itself into line with the world opinion on what kinds of biological technology should and shouldn't be used. So is there a possibility of coming to some kind of a more global set of standards around AI that would bring all the rogue nations in if they want to be part of the exchange of information and the use of you know, borrowing actual components of algorithms from one country or buying them? Is that a possibility? Is AI amenable to that?
Yeah, I think it is. Another analogy is climate change, right? I mean, which there's problems with that in terms of the U.S. participation. Now that's changing, like for example, the Kyoto Protocol. But I think, like, because of the nature of climate change and its effect globally, affecting the totality of humanity, AI is definitely in that category, and so I think that precludes or implies a possibility of consensus in that sense as well. I'll start there.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'll say that I think the question was stumping and absolutely valid, but it kind of speaks to what Michael talked about earlier, where we all kind of, and I'm glad you brought the example in genetics, because I don't want to have to think about the and in China and the competitive part of it. But it speaks to what we said earlier, that this is kind of a interdisciplinary thing. Like the AI as it develops is that powerful that we have to hope and strive and push for that global unifying human type of experience. Like it doesn't have to be kumbaya, but it has to be a global or unifying thing, because it is a increasingly powerful or stair-step in human capability tool. So with that, I mean, and it goes back to, I'm glad you brought up a lot of the genetics examples, because you hope that with it being of similar power or challenges or fears, that it helps us kind of go into this development of AI with that holistic ethics and social impact thought, not just the technology and capability or capitalism thought. So that's kind of my take on
it. I think it's possible. I think we should try. We should at least try. I mean, I think there's a whole range of global issues where different nations, you know, at least have a conversation and try to cooperate. I mean, even war, right? Like, you know, there's war crimes. There's certain rules of engagement. So even when it comes to survival, there's certain base rules we can agree on. So at least there's a possibility that in the field of AI, there will be as well. There will be different philosophies, different ethics models, and different value systems in play. But maybe there's some fundamental, you know, bases and rules that we can all agree on, and that's a start. And so, you know, I think, you know, to the point of earlier, maybe we should talk about how to regulate it. I think maybe it should be a global discussion sooner rather than later. You know, get input from everybody and hopefully arrive at a similar consensus so that we can set the rules of engagement and have the same field to compete in.
Daniel, you want to make a quick last comment to take us out?
Yeah, I was just going to say that you know, the reward for participating in this should greatly exceed, you know, the reward for going alone. So to the extent that, I mean, I think you know, arms race, those are like sort of bad examples, but having a credible deterrence, you know, by forming a League of Nations type thing, I think is probably how we're going to get there. And so I think through research and education, knowing you know, what is possible, I think helps us understand, you know, what we need to protect for and what we need to build a community around. So that's what I would think.
Thanks. Well, we're out of time. I will tell you that there was supposed to be a World Governance of AI meeting last March that got canceled by COVID. I need to check back and see what they're doing now, if they're rescheduling it. Thanks, everybody. I'm going to turn the mic back to Robert to take us out.
Thank you, everybody. I really appreciate everybody's time and effort. One last question I love asking at the end of it is just like one 30-second takeaway, all the panelists would like the audience to take away with, if you all are up for it.
That we would like our attendees to take away.
Yeah.
Okay.
My one final thought. 30.
Yeah, I'll go first, and I'll piggyback off of what Dan said, because I actually enjoyed this, and you know, we all don't know each other. Dan and I know each other real well, but just the insight that I got from other perspectives is awesome and helps you expand. But I think the key takeaway is, as powerful and as transformative as we believe AI is, I think research and education being forefront and pushing that education into early ages, because AI is here and they're already using, you know, computational devices. I think we should push artificial intelligence and understanding of this, including the social and ethical side, earlier into education and educate across the globe, because we don't know when we're going to solve these problems, and we know we need to start the conversations, but we need to start the conversations and the education. So I'll leave with that.
I'll say, picking back off of Daniel again, the incentivizing interests, right? It's in all, I think the main takeaway is it's in all our interests to think very critically now about this technology and how it's going to change us and change society. It's critical thinking here, which I'm very, very passionate about. I think that's one of the biggest takeaways here. It's in all our interests, as governments, consumers, companies, individuals, humans, to think critically about the nature of artificial intelligence as a technology that's going to change things, and it already has.
Yeah, I would say, if you were somebody, well, at least in the short term, I'd say there's no like immediate alarm if you're worried about, like, you know, a super AI coming to kill us all like next year or something. That said, you know, it's time to start the conversation. And I think that's, you know, that's true for experts as well as just a regular consumer. To bring awareness to these issues and kind of expose the nuances. And then, you know, to Michael's point, like apply critical thinking, right? How can we get the benefits while mitigating the risks, right? That's what it comes down to. And I think everyone being educated on it, discussing it, you know, with your friends, with your family, as well as the experts, really talking about how to align certain regulation and certain rules of engagement, even at a global level. I think it's time for that to happen.
Yeah, and I'll just say ditto. I mean,
I'll only add the sentence that, you know, experts also need to bring in experts on ethics and other related fields. You know, this is an area of expertise and an opportunity for people who are designing AI to have these conversations with people who understand how to have these conversations.
Well said.
Thank you to all our panelists for contributing your time and knowledge and expertise on this very interesting topic. And I hope all of our participants got some value out of it and learned something new. I know I surely did. So thank you so much for taking some time out of your day to be with us, and looking forward to the next event, which is 2 weeks from today on June 2nd, also for the second series on AI. So thank you very much, and I hope everybody has a great evening.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks a lot, everyone.
So much.